Ramez Naam is a computer scientist and an author at this point. He's the H.G. Wells award-winning author of More Than Human, Embracing the Promise of Biological Enhancement. That was his first nonfiction book. He's also the author of two science fiction novels, one called Nexus and the other one Crux. At least one of them has been taken up to do a movie on it. And I was telling Ramez, I said, gee, I want you to do another nonfiction book. He goes like, Terry, he said, the amount of recognition you get from a nonfiction book versus science fiction. And apparently he's up for another award, science fiction award. And also, if any of you really are interested in the sci-fi part of this, he'll be speaking at Tigard Library Friday night at 7. They have a little deal out there that he's going to do. So they're very impressed because he's a sci-fi genius. Anyway, and those books are about stories about nanotechnology that links the human, links mind and the struggle for control. So anyway, Ramez has spent 13 years at Microsoft, where he led teams working on email, web browsing, internet search, and artificial intelligence. He holds 19 patents as inventor, Microsoft patents as the inventor of those, involved in those patents. So more recently, let's say background. So he was born in Egypt, actually, and his mother was coming over. Both his mother and father have MDs, and his mother was coming over to do a PhD in the United States, and so came over. Ramez was 3 years old, and he's been here forever since. So, and he'll talk about that maybe a little bit tonight, the comparison there. And he did his degree in computer science at University of Illinois and was hired directly out of that into Microsoft, where been at Microsoft and done all that cool stuff there. So his most recent book which is about accelerating innovation and how that's going to help overcome all the environmental problems. That's what he's going to talk about tonight. And that book's called The Infinite Resource, The Power of Ideas on a Finite Planet. It's really a brilliant book, and I was complimenting him about it before, but some tough ideas, but he sections it off in such a beautiful way to make it very, very understandable. So we only have 20 copies back there, but if you don't get one of those tonight, then I highly recommend you get it off Amazon or whatever. Anyway, so with all that, now I've oversold him a little bit, so he'll have to lean up to that. So help me welcome Ramez Naam.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, ISEP. Thank you, First Congregation Church, for having us here, and thank you, all of you, for coming. As Terry said, my name is Ramez Naam. I came down here from Seattle. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and hopefully I'll fill you with a little bit of hope tonight, though I might get you a little bit down first. I've been known to do that. So if you got a little bit down, please bear with me. The question I'm going to ask is, can innovation save the planet? And to some extent, really, it's not the planet that needs saving so much as it's us. The planet in the long term will be okay. It's really those of us who depend upon it, and the animals and plants on it that depend upon it too, that are more in trouble. So this is all based on the book that Terry mentioned, The Infinite Resource, The Power of Ideas on a Finite Planet. And I want to start with a question or a couplet that opened the book A Tale of Two Cities more than 150 years ago. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Because I think this, in a large sense, captures the way we think about the world today and the way the world today is. In a lot of ways, this is the best time ever that we have seen for humanity. And in other ways, we're facing the largest risks that we've ever faced. So let's talk about those two things. It was the best of times. Let me start with a personal story. I was born in a working class neighborhood in Cairo, Egypt, that looks an awful lot like this one. I was born in 1973. As Terry said, I came to the US at age 3 in 1976. When I was born, infant mortality in Egypt was 15%. So I had a 1 in 6 chance of not making it to my 5th birthday. Actually, I was a preemie by about a month. So I had about a 1 in 4 chance of not making it to my 5th birthday. But that actually was nothing compared to what my folks went through, actually, because their generations, without being preemies, just faced in general a 1 in 4 infant mortality rate. In fact, in my dad's family, 3 kids died in infancy. In my mom's family, 5 kids died in infancy. In my dad's family, he's the eldest kid, except he wasn't. Actually, there was a child born before him that had his name, and then my dad was born, they just recycled the name. That wasn't cruel or unusual, it's just what you did, because kids just died in infancy at that time. So growing up in the States, hearing all these stories of the old world, as a young kid I was bored, I was like, yeah, America's great, the old world sucks. Then I came to appreciate that I was learning things about how the world worked, but I came to appreciate that I was also getting a view back, not just at different countries, but a view back in time. Because it wasn't that long ago that the entire world looked like that. Because in the US in 1900, infant mortality was 25%. In the US in 1900, in Chicago, infant mortality was 33%. 1 in 3 kids born in Chicago in 1900 died before their 5th birthday. And now the change is just stunning. Egypt today, even in the midst of turmoil and so on, is 2%. In the US, it's 0.7%. In Europe, it's about 0.5%. So that's how far we've come in sort of an eye blink in human history. So that one set of numbers, that story to me just speaks of incredible progress in just a few generations. So you can see that around the world, people live longer. The black line is the rich nations, the US and Europe and so on. The red line is the whole rest of the world. And not only is everyone living longer, in 1900, the average life expectancy around the world was 33 years. Now it's 67, so it's about doubled. But the gap is also converging. The poor world is catching up with the rich world. Poverty is plummeting around the world. The fraction of the world that lives in absolute poverty has gone from about 1/3 of the world in 1970 to now about 5% of the world, 10% depending upon what metric you use. Is it $1 a day? Is it $2 a day? Whatever number you use, that fraction of the world in absolute poverty has plummeted. Now I'm going to throw some questions for you all out there as I go through these slides. So here's the first one. What place is this? Who can name it? Shanghai. Okay, that's an easy one. Shanghai 20 years ago was little more than a fishing village around the river. It was really, there's no skyscrapers and old pictures of it, just set in 1980. It's just low buildings. The rise of Shanghai to this mega metropolis represents how the world has changed radically. It's almost a 19th century to 21st century change in 30 years. And that represents that now 3 billion people have access to the internet, where basically no one did 30 years ago. There's 7 billion people that have mobile phones. We have just leapfrogged forward, and that represents humanity getting healthier, longer lived, getting more freedom, more access to information. This is the best time ever on the face of the earth to be born, compared to all previous ages, no doubt about it. Okay. So best of times. All right, so why would I possibly say it's the worst of times? Because the way that we've built that best of times depends upon the natural resources of the planet that we live on, and those natural resources are under threat, in part because we've had to utilize them to get to where we are. The world's forests, they've been called the planet's lungs. They filter water, rainfall, they purify that water, they house about 3/4 of the biodiversity of the species that we know of on land. They actually cause rainfall to happen by a process called evapotranspiration. In ancient times, forests covered about 2/3 of the land area of the Earth. Now they cover about 1/3 of the land area of the Earth. Mostly we've chopped them down to make area to grow food, to grow plants and to graze cattle. We've actually made good progress in slowing that down in the last decade or so, but it's still happening. And in the next 40 years, we have to grow about 70% more food to keep up with growing demand as people get richer and they eat more meat, primarily. So that's one piece of ecological resource that we need that's under pressure. Water. Water is life. We use 70% of the world's water to grow food. Okay? There's plenty of water in the world, but there are some challenges. Who can name this body of water? The RLC. You are a good audience. The RLC is the 4th largest body of fresh water in the world. Well, it was the 4th largest body of fresh water in the world, and now it's nothing. Right? The RLC went from being what it was to being what it is because the USSR in its late days, and then Russia and Ukraine, took the rivers that flowed into it, and then the sea itself, or the lake really, and pumped water out of it to grow wheat and cotton in Ukraine and other areas. And now it's basically gone. Nothing protected it. Now, I show this picture. The RLC nestles between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So most American audiences have a hard time finding it on a map. I have a hard time finding it on a map, to be totally honest. So let's come closer to home. Who can name this location? You're a damn good audience. This is indeed the Oglala Aquifer. Now, of course, there's no giant lake that stretches from Nebraska to Texas on the surface in the Midwest, but there is such a giant lake underground in that area. This is fossil water. You've heard the term fossil fuels. Fossil fuels take millions of years to form. We call them fossil because they're that old. They're as old as the dinosaurs, more or less. Fossil water isn't quite as old, but this water formed over the repeated melt and retreat of glaciers during the ice ages, over multiple ice ages. So it probably took about 100,000 years for this water to be deposited over multiple ice age retreats. We started pumping this water after the Dust Bowl, right? So after World War II, really. In that time, we've pumped out at least a quarter of it. There's places now in upper Texas where the pumps have gone dry, the wells have gone dry. In the middle here, the water table is dropping at 3 feet per year. And the current projection is that by 2050, we'll have pumped out more than half of that water. And the refill time is again about 100,000 years. So on the scale of human civilization, once it's gone, it's more or less gone. Again, the planet will be fine. Like once we're gone, 100,000 years is blink of the eye to the planet, so we shouldn't worry about it. But for agriculture, if you're a farmer in this area, if you're irrigating your crops by pumping this water, when it's gone, you've got to have to find an alternate way to either grow your crops, or you're going to move, or find an alternate way to make a living, not to mention how we're going to feed ourselves. Now, for all that, the US is not a place that has that much water stress compared to other parts of the world. This is a map of the number of people around the world that are under water stress, that have their way of life under pressure from stress of availability of water, again, mostly to grow food. And that big red blob is really the intersection of 3 nations that all get their water from the melt of glaciers in the spring in the Himalayas. And those nations are China, India, and Pakistan. Those glaciers provide water that feeds about 1 billion people. Those 3 nations are all nuclear armed. And they have all traded threats back and forth about the damming of rivers and over-withdrawals of water from rivers. And when you look at the Defense Department's threat levels and their threat projections for 2030 and 2035, they talk about wars over water as being one of the big threats that they see. So this is there's a confluence of human welfare, welfare of the planet, and global security, that this is actually what the Defense Intelligence Agency talks about, that we see reflected here. Plenty of fish in the sea. We've all heard that one at some point in the past. I have to explain that if I talk to a foreign audience, but here I don't. There's fewer fish in the sea than there used to be. Basically, every species that humans eat is overfished, either to the point of collapse that we're not sure if it'll recover or not, or to the point that we simply can't fish anymore. And when you look at how hard we have to fish, the amount of tonnage of boats you have to send out, multiplied by how far they have to go to bring back the same tonnage of catch, is up by a factor of 10 to 100, because the fish that are out there are just far thinner and far further from shore. There's just fewer of them out there for us to catch. No one protects the fish in the deep ocean. Okay? And then there's the problem that kind of exacerbates all the rest, which is climate change. The planet has a fever, more or less. Here's how temperature has changed around the planet over the last 130 years or so. It's gone up. It's a noisy graph, right? Weather is not a simple thing. Climate is not a simple thing. It doesn't go up in a nice straight line. It goes up and down, up and down. Sometimes the next year is chillier than the year before. Sometimes it takes a big dip for a long time, and then it comes back up. But sort of over the long term, inexorably, even though it has these dips, it goes up and up and up. And we know why it is. We've known since the 1890s that if we pumped enough greenhouse gases up, they would trap infrared light and the planet would get warmer. We can see in ice cores from Antarctica this one is over 500,000 years. We have some that go back 1 million years. We have cores from sediment at the bottom of lakes that go back 7 million years, that CO2 levels and temperature just go hand in hand. How many of you have heard that climate change stopped 15 years ago? The planet stopped warming. I've heard it. People tell me that all the time. So this is what we call the climate escalator. I can tell you climate change stopped anytime I want to, and yet it keeps going up for some reason. I don't know why, because I keep stopping it. But it keeps going up. Now, I like graphs, I like numbers, I'm a numbers guy. But they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So though I do love this animation. But let me show you something a little bit more graphical. This is the Bear Glacier in Alaska, 1920. Here's the Bear Glacier today. This is the Peterson Glacier in Alaska in 1920. This is the Peterson Glacier today. See that again? Watch the mountains. Peterson Glacier, 1920. Peterson Glacier today. Climate change is felt first and hardest near the poles for a variety of reasons, but then eventually it finds its way to the rest of the planet. Now, when we think about glaciers melting and so on, we think about sea levels rising, right? And sea level rise will happen. It'll happen maybe 3 or 4 feet this century, something like that. And that's substantial. But that is something that we can think about, oh, that'll happen decades out in the future. But we're seeing impacts of climate change happen not just in the future, we're seeing it right now already. 2003, Europe had its worst heat wave on record since 1540. But actually, the worst heat wave on record, period. Just the records only go back to 1540. Ukraine lost 3/4 of its wheat crop. 70,000 people died of excess complications of heat. Portugal saw 1/10 of its forests burned down in that year. 2009, China saw a once-in-a-century level drought. 2010, China saw another once-in-a-century level drought. My stats are not that good, but I think something is a little off there. Wells that had given water for 500 years went dry. Now, when the rains came back, they came back on Pakistan. And 1/5 of that country, Pakistan is about the same size as California, 1/5 of that country was underwater. 15 million people were evacuated. Rains like this have never been recorded in Pakistan. How are these two things linked? Warm air can carry more moisture. So warm air can suck up more moisture, or it can deposit more moisture, but it doesn't do so homogeneously. Otherwise, it'll just be more humid all the time. Instead, it can suck up more from one place and then bring it down hard in another place and time. So we see more drought and also more torrential rainfall at the same time. The rainfall is more concentrated overall. Russia, 2010, 55,000 people died of heat in just July and August. 11,000 people died in Moscow of the heat wave in July and August, just in Moscow alone. And in the US, 2 years between 2011 and 2012 went through 2 of the worst drought years we've had this century. All of that has happened with just the first half of this graph, just from here to here, more or less. The right half is what could happen. The blue line is our really optimistic line. This is what we hope happens. If we get our act together and act really aggressively, we'll just have another degree Celsius or so of warming. So it'll keep going, but we'll get it under control. The red line is if it's business as usual and we don't restrain our carbon emissions, what's likely to happen. And climate models are really hard. They're very messy. People will report to you, oh, it's going to rise exactly 4.8 degrees Celsius. We don't know that. There's big error bars. That's why you see this big spread here. Maybe we'll get lucky and it'll just be the low end of this. Maybe we'll get unlucky and it'll be the high end of that. Somewhere in there. So big spectrum, but none of those numbers are very good. Another way to look at it, here's the long-term temperature of the planet. This is a 10,000 year long graph. This is agriculture was invented. The pyramids were built around here. Rome was founded around here. Jesus was born. The United States was, established around here or so. And this has happened in the last 100 years, the last 50 years or so. And that is the next 80 projected. So civilization has not existed during the temperature spectrum that we're looking at. And to get to the blue line that I showed 2 graphs ago, the optimistic line, what we have to do is take our carbon emissions and cut them by a factor of 5 in the next 50 years, which is a very tall order, instead of doubling or tripling them in that time, which is sort of the business as usual path. So it's a very, very, very tall order. Put that all together, all those numbers, agriculture, forestry, water, fish, so on. People try to say, give me one number for how much we're using up of the planet. And we try to put this together, and people say, our footprint on the planet is not just one planet Earth, it's about 1.5 planet Earths. And we don't really have a spare half planet Earth. And that's especially problematic because all that progress that the other 6 billion people on Earth are making, who are no less deserving than people who live in the US or Europe, it comes at the cost of using more steel, more water, more electricity, burning more carbon. And if everyone lived like a North American, then we're using about 5 planet Earths worth of resources. And that's more or less the thesis of books like Limits to Growth, which is the best-selling environmental book of all time, that says basically the planet's full. It's a thesis of a lot of books. Thomas Malthus wrote a book a long time ago from which we coined the phrase Malthusian that said, hey, you can't grow anymore. It was about 200 years ago he wrote this. Or Paul Ehrlich in the 1960s wrote a book, The Population Bomb, that said people are going to starve, we're going to have massive famines. Okay? A lot of people have seen this as a problem for a long time. That's the depressing part of my talk. From here on, I'm going to talk about optimism. So how can I give you all of this depressing stuff and still have optimism that we can overcome these problems? The first reason I have is that we have a long history of overcoming limits. What's this? Sperm whale, very good. This is a Pacific sperm whale. It's eating a giant squid. So that gives you an idea of how big it is. The Pacific sperm whale almost went extinct. Over a period of about 20 years, we killed off a third of these creatures in the 1850s and 60s, actually. A fleet of about 1,000 whaling ships in North America killed off about 250,000 of them out of a population of 750,000. We killed them off not because we ate sperm whale meat, but because they were an energy source. Sperm whale oil was the premier source of lighting at that time. These are sperm whale oil lamps from Texas. Sperm whale oil produced a clear, odorless, flicker-free, high-quality source of illumination. It was highly prized. It was the very, very best sort of lighting you could get. As a result, there was huge demand for it. People would pay a lot of money for it. And so people built more and more whaling ships to try to find these sperm whales and kill them and bring back the oil and so on. Then the whales became thinner in number, and the whales that were still out there would kind of flee and so on. Moby Dick was based on a true story of a sperm whale, a male sperm whale that had been attacked by a few ships, saw a whaling ship attacking a pod of females. The male that had been attacked a few times got enraged and dove, came up and rammed the ship and sank it, a ship called the Essex, and Melville heard about this and wrote Moby Dick. And then eventually the the supply of sperm whale oil started to go down when they just couldn't find any more sperm whales to kill because they were getting so scarce. So a Canadian fellow named Abraham Gessner said, there's got to be a new way. There's a huge market here. How do I address this? There must be some other way to do this. And he invented something called kerosene. And that's why he has a stamp in Canada. He was a geologist and physician. You could be both of those things in the 1850s. And he, so far as we know, was not an environmentalist in any way. He didn't write about the whales in his journals, but he saw that the world wanted and needed some way to provide lighting for itself. And his invention of kerosene could be produced at a tiny fraction of the cost of whale oil and at dramatically huger volumes, at thousands of times the volume that you would ever capture from whales. And a few years after he invented this, after this innovation, the whaling fleet was gone. They were just moored up because nobody wanted whale oil anymore when they had a better invention. And so, as a result, he may have saved the whales. Interestingly enough, his innovation, although you can still get kerosene lamps, was mostly shoved aside a couple decades later by Thomas Edison's invention of the electric light. So it didn't last that long in the marketplace either. But what we saw here is that the opportunity, a great need that people had, drove innovation. The incentive that he saw, which was he was really out to make a buck in this case, drove that innovation. So that's one reason that I see, is that we have this long history of overcoming limits. That's just one example. The second reason that I'm optimistic is that the actual resources that are out there, clean resources, are actually tremendously vast. We're just not tapped into the right resources. Let me show you how vast they are. This drop of oil represents all the energy that humanity uses in a year. Right? All the oil, coal, natural gas, all of it. And it would be a very big drop of oil if we drew it to scale. But it is actually dwarfed by the much larger source of energy that we're constantly bathed in, which is the influx of energy constantly hitting our planet from the sun. And that influx is roughly 10,000 times larger at the top of the atmosphere. What that means is that 10 seconds of sunlight hitting the planet contains the same energy as 1 day of humanity's energy use from all sources combined. 1 hour of sunlight hitting the planet has the same energy content as 1 year of humanity's energy use. That energy manifests in multiple different ways. It heats different parts of the atmosphere differently, which causes wind to flow, which we can tap into via wind power. It causes evaporation of water, which then comes down as rainfall, which we can tap into as hydropower. And it comes down as direct photons that hit the ground, which are so abundant that about 1/3 of 1% of the land area of the planet is enough with current technology to power all of human civilization, if you could make enough panels cheaply enough to actually deploy to this much land. Okay? So there's more than enough energy. What about water? Well, we live on a water world. 70% of the surface of the planet is water, just so that water is salty. In fact, we access just 1/3 of 1% of about 3% of the world's water. That's just a little tiny fraction of the water of the world is what we're tapped into. There's a much larger source of water, it's just that that water is not in a form that we can use to water our crops or to drink ourselves right now. We're just tapped into the wrong resource. Food. We know that farms are essentially converters of solar energy into chemical form, calories that we can consume. And we know that they could be much more efficient. This is a report from the International Food Policy Research Institute that says that we could grow about 35 times as much food with current farmland. But we're just not there yet. Basically, our technology of farming is not good enough yet. So the limit is not how vast the resource is. The limit is how innovative we are. And the right innovations can multiply access to those resources. Okay? Here's an example. This is a wafer of solar cells. And it looks just like a wafer of microprocessors, so the CPUs in your phone or your laptop or your tablet, because they've been built the same way for a long time. They're made of silicon, they're etched, and that's a very, very expensive process, or it has been. But it's been getting tremendously, tremendously cheaper. Over the last 30 years, the cost of solar power has dropped by more than a factor of 20, which is gigantic. You can buy 20 times as much solar power for $1 now than you could in 1980. So something that was completely impractical a generation ago is now actually becoming cost competitive and on a path to be not just cost competitive, but possibly the cheapest source of energy anywhere. And we can see that the crossover is starting to happen. This is First Solar's Macho Springs plant in Nevada. The wholesale cost of electricity in the US is about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. This is the first solar plant in the US to be at that price, more or less. And again, we're still seeing the price get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So in a decade, it could be at half the wholesale price. In Chile, we have a 162 megawatt plant that's completely unsubsidized. In the south of Spain, another sunny area, 250 megawatts, that's a good sized plant, completely unsubsidized. And now the world's largest plant going in, the Sambar Ultra plant in India, 4 gigawatts, that's the size of 4 giant coal plants or 4 large nuclear plants, completely unsubsidized, being built right now. Over the last just 10 years, so the last 5 years, the amount of solar power we have deployed around the world has gone up by a factor of 10. Over the last 10 years, it's gone up by nearly a factor of 25, which is unprecedented for any energy technology ever. It doesn't happen homogeneously. We're here in Portland. Portland isn't so bad. I'm from Seattle. This is a map of how much sunlight we get per area. Portland is in the yellow. Seattle is actually getting into the green. So the places where solar is going to do well in the US start in these deep red areas and then spread out. And you see in Europe, same thing. The rich countries that are actually deploying a lot of solar are doing so because they're rich, not because they have a lot of sunlight. The places where we're going to get a lot of it are these areas that are actually the less economically developed areas. And it's really interesting to me that if you look at a map of where the sunlight is, which is what this is, if you took a map of the roughly billion people around the world that don't have access to electricity, they are largely concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, India, and a little stretch of South Asia over here, most of which are pretty darn sunny. So we are poised to see a lot of those people get access to modern energy first, not by getting connected to the grid, but via solar in a decentralized way, in much the same way that they got access to telephones, not via landlines, but via cell phones, and completely skipped landlines. So that's solar technology. Wind has had its own ramp that has been also incredibly impressive in how it's innovated. The cost of wind power per kilowatt hour in the US, and this is something we excel at in the Northwest, has dropped by a factor of 10 over the last 20 years, just about, which again is just an incredible thing. You just don't see any other technologies, but these two have this incredible and steady price decline. And so we've also seen the amount of wind power deploy just go through the roof, from 30 gigawatts in 2002 to 280 in 2012. Just an incredible increase that we don't see in any other area. Now, we don't need to just collect this energy, we've got to be able to store it. Because we need to have electricity not just when the wind is blowing or when the sun is shining, but at night or on days when the wind isn't blowing. And we need to be able to stick energy in dense forms into our vehicles so we can drive from point A to point B, even if they're not wired into something. So we need to be able to have some sort of energy storage as well. And in some ways, that's now a bigger challenge than actually getting energy in a renewable way. But that's been an area of incredible progress too. The cost of battery energy storage has made incredible strides. The cost of batteries, such like those in your phones, your laptops, and so on, dropped by about a factor of 15 over the last 20 years, mostly as battery manufacturers and laptop manufacturers competed for your business. Everybody knew that they had to make a product that lasted longer and that was at a lower and lower price point. And those are the same technologies that go into electric cars like Teslas and Nissan Volts and so on, and the same technologies that in some cases are being deployed for grid storage of solar. Again, this is really about just innovations in all of these fields. You see electric vehicle battery prices have fallen, almost by half in just the last 4 years. So I started with energy and talking about the abundance of natural resources out there because energy is this master resource. If we can crack energy, we can crack so many other resource challenges that are out there. We can crack food. We have to grow about 70% more food by 2050, is what the United Nations says, in order to keep up with global demand. And we know that it's possible. Here's what we know. The left bar is how much food the world grows per acre today. The middle bar is how much food we need to grow per acre if we were to try to feed the world in 2050 on current farmland. The right bar is how much food American farms grow per acre today. So if we simply had the same crop yields as US farms worldwide, and you could substitute in Canadian farms or European farms or Australian farms right here, if we could achieve this level of yield worldwide, we would be there to solve the problem. And this is mostly a difference in energy and capital. The reason that our farms do so much better than those most of the rest of the world is that farmers in the United States can afford tractors and fertilizer and irrigation systems and so on. That's an energy input issue, really. So that's one thing. If we had enough energy and capital around the world, this would be a solvable problem. That's one way to do it. There might be a second way to do it, though, and this is possibly one of the more controversial things that I'll say tonight. This is corn, this is wheat. Which of these grows more food per acre? Corn. Okay, people, I heard corn first. That is the right answer. Corn grows more calories per acre by about 70%. And it does so because of a very modern innovation. It has something called C4 photosynthesis, which is just a better way of using sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to make sugar, basically, to make carbohydrates. And like I said, it's very, very modern. It's just about 30 million years ago that it came up with it, so kudos to it. So a group of scientists funded by the Gates Foundation is working on could they take the genes that give corn that ability and move those genes into rice and wheat and give rice and wheat the ability to grow 50% or 70% more food per acre. That would be a genetically modified rice or genetically modified wheat that would have the 30,000 wheat genes plus a gene or two borrowed from corn. But it wouldn't be one out to make a buck for someone. It would be someone given away for free to farmers around the world to help them increase the amount of food they can grow. Or here we have soybeans and wheat. Which one requires more fertilizer? Wheat. Soybeans are legumes, and soybeans can suck nitrogen out of the air. Fertilizer is about nitrogen. And soybeans and clover and some other things like that have symbiotic bacteria that just suck nitrogen out of the air, where it's 78% of the air that we breathe. But wheat and rice and corn can't do that, but even though we eat a lot more of those. And a lot of the energy difference between Western farmers and developing world farmers is, can you afford to buy fertilizer? And a lot of the negative consequences of agriculture are fertilizer runoffs into rivers that cause things like the Gulf Dead Zone, which you don't really get with soybeans. So another group funded by the Gates Foundation is asking, could we take the genes that allow plants like soy and clover to fertilize themselves and move those into crops like wheat and corn and rice and create versions of wheat and soy and rice that fertilize themselves? And again, that would be a genetically modified crop, but again, not one intended to make a buck or sell more product to these farmers. In fact, they would need less product to buy afterwards, and we would have less fertilizer runoff into rivers like Mississippi. Here's another thing. We talked about how most of the world's water is salt water. So if we cracked energy, we could turn that salt water into fresh. Enough energy, you can boil salt water, make it fresh water. So that's one reason that cracking energy unlocks a lot of other things. And desalination we've talked about for a long time. It turns out, though, that not only can you use energy to turn salt water into fresh, but we've gotten smart. We've innovated over the last 40 years, so the amount of energy it takes to desalinate water has dropped by about a factor of 10. It used to be that we boiled it, but we have increasingly mimicked what biology does. Every cell in your body is capable of desalinating water. Every cell in your body has a membrane around it that is semi-permeable, that lets certain things through and not other things. So scientists in the 1970s started trying to mimic this with plastics and have learned to make things, membranes, that will let the salt through or not, and let the water through or not the salt. And so over the last decades, the last 40 years, we've cut the amount of energy that we need to use to desalinate water by about a factor of 10. Desalination used to be thought of as an incredibly anti-environmental technology, but now it starts to look like something that could be quite pro-environmental. And in fact, if you look at the most modern desalination plants, Israel is a country that does a lot of desalination. So it's right in the desert, but on the sea. The cost of desalinated water there is about 1 cent for 5 gallons of water. That's the cost of desalinated water, which is it's a lot cheaper than the bottled water you buy at the store. And it's getting to the point of being cheap enough almost to do agriculture for. So the right innovation doesn't just multiply access to resources. The right innovation can actually reduce the amount of a resource that we need to use. Airplanes of today use 1/3 the amount of fuel that they did in the 1960s. Americans today use about 1/3 less oil than we used per person in the 1970s. Water use per person in America peaked in the late 1970s and is now back. If we had the 2010 numbers, we'd see that it was back down to where it was in the 1950s, mostly because our farms have gotten so much more efficient. And as innovations have added more wealth and have allowed us to spread education and have given more freedom and more choices, especially to women, they've not just made us more efficient and grown our resources, they've done something else. The population bomb that was talked about in the 60s has diffused itself almost. We're not done yet, but almost. In 1950, the average woman on Earth would have 5 children over the course of her life. But as we've gotten richer, as women have gotten more educated, and as they've gotten more control over their own lives and more options, and as they've started to realize that these innovations have given them those options, that number has plunged from 5 children over the course of a woman's lifetime to now down to about 2.5. And when it hits 2.1, the replacement rate, then we're done with population growth, more or less. And we're looking at that happening at maybe 2060, something like that. The United States is the only large industrialized nation that has positive population growth, and that's only really because of immigration at this point. You look around the world, and countries that you wouldn't think it are actually below 2.0. Iran is at 1.6. Brazil is below 2.0. All around the world, these numbers have plunged incredibly, and that's really because we've gotten richer and spread education. Not only that, if we're stabilizing the number of people on Earth, we're doing something else as well. We've started to decouple how wealthy we are, how well off we are, with how much we consume. And this is the most complicated graph I'll show for the whole evening, I promise. The red lines here are consumption and pollution, and the green line is well-being, more or less. The green line is GDP per person in the US. The red line is carbon emissions and energy use. And you see the carbon emissions per person in the US are flat to slightly down. Energy use per person is flat. But GDP is more or less doubled. Okay? Around the world, it's more or less the same. There's a slight rise in energy use per person, but not by much. These numbers are decoupling. How can that be? The limits to growth said, if you're going to get richer, you're going to use more, you're going to consume more, you're going to pollute more. You can't help it. The only way to get richer is to trash the planet. But this is saying something different. It's saying that you can decouple these things. That notion of like the US's water use peaked and went down. We're using less oil. How can these things be? Okay? Well, let me give you a story. The thing on the left is an iPhone. I think it's an iPhone 3 or something. It's already antiquated. And the thing on the right is ENIAC. ENIAC is the first digital computer. It was built at my alma mater, UIUC. ENIAC was built, during World War II. If you tried to build something as powerful as the iPhone 3 using ENIAC technology, you would have a cube about 2 miles on a side, and to run it, just to have like a day of like ordinary running it, it would use all of the power of the state of California, and it still couldn't play Angry Birds or take pictures or have anyone to talk to. So this is a classic example. That thing does more. It's millions of times more powerful than ENIAC, or billions or trillions or something, while weighing ounces where this thing weighed thousands of tons. It's got less steel, less wiring, less power draw by being more powerful. And the reason is that the phone isn't made of plastic and metal. This thing is made of ideas. This thing is made of information. This is made of human knowledge. Okay? It's imprinted in a thin layer of matter. But the important thing about this is accumulated human knowledge. And ideas are unlike any other natural resource. And this is the most optimistic thing, really. Ideas are unlike any other natural resource, because ideas don't get chipped, they don't get broken, they don't get worn out by time. If I give you an idea, I still have it. Ideas naturally grow. They're naturally positive sum. I can give an idea to all of you. I just did, in fact. But I still have it too. Ideas accumulate over time. You'll give me an idea, I'll give you an idea. Together we'll make a brand new idea. And our stockpile of ideas as a civilization will just grow and grow and grow. It's the one resource that we always have more of over time instead of less of. And that's the fundamental resource that was just always growing in our society. All right, so problem solved, right? We can all go home. No, the problem is not solved, sadly. What we have is a race. We have a race between the rate of consumption and the rate of innovation. And I wish I could tell you that it's obvious that innovation is going to win, but it's not obvious. The growth rate of carbon emissions, can wax poetic about how awesome solar and wind are, but carbon emissions are still growing. Okay? When you look at how much carbon we can emit and stay below safe numbers versus how much the known reserves of all fossil fuel companies are, we can only emit about a quarter of that, which says that there's about $22 trillion of known assets that we can't burn, which is something that shareholders and executives will have some pushback on. Right? When you look at the total amount of renewable energy we have to deploy, 0.3% of the land area of the planet. It's nothing. We got plenty of land. Deserts cover 20% of the land area of the planet. No problem. We have plenty of land. We've got plenty of silicon. It's just more sand. Totally easy. Except that it would be about 10 million of these, which is a very large endeavor. And even on current price projections, they would take trillions of dollars, take decades, and the planet will warm up 2 degrees. We'll lock in 2 to 3 degrees of warming in that time. Okay. So we're still in a very critical race. If climate change was going 100 years slower, I'd say no problem, we've got this licked. But it turns out the timing is such that it's going to be a very exciting race. Exciting in the bad way, maybe. So how do we win this race? It's good if you're a novelist, actually. How do we win this race? There's a million things I could talk to you about. We amping up the rate of R&D. The US government should be investing more in basic science in all these areas. Great. Education. We need more people educated in the basic science and engineering so they can contribute in these areas. Okay, not going to talk about that. Poverty reduction. If don't get past the 3rd grade in some poor country, you're not going to get to the point where you can really contribute to that Technical areas where you can help us. Okay, great. GMOs. No one's thrown an organic tomato at me yet today, but technology acceptance overall is the issue here. Things like GMOs and nuclear power are actually pro-environmental technologies that are being tossed out that we should have more acceptance of. Talk about that. I'm not going to talk about those things. There's only so much time. I'm going to talk about one thing, which is fixing the market. Okay? Fixing market failures, specifically. Because the market is what runs most of the world at this point. And its failures are what are really causing the problems, and if we can just fix those, we'll accelerate the solutions tremendously. What is a market failure? Well, let me show you. This is the Cuyahoga River outside of Cleveland. Beautiful place. It wasn't always so beautiful. Here's what it looked like in 1968. You could stick your hand in this river and pull it out covered in oil and gunk and chemicals. It was wood and detritus floating on the river. Okay? Why was that? This was a market failure. So market failure because this river was lined in factories and warehouses. These factories and warehouses chose to site themselves along the river because it provided easy transportation of their goods and easy waste disposal. Great. They've got, we got some leftover oil, whatever, just dump it in the river. Because it's free. No one owned the river. The river was a commons. It was zero cost to just dump their stuff out there, right? It's zero cost to everyone. Oh, no. Zero cost to the business, but of course there was cost to someone else downstream. That's what I mean by a market failure. When there is really a cost to someone, but the person doing the damage doesn't pay it. All right? Well, this went on for years and years and years. Of the 30 species of fish in the river, 27 went extinct, yada, yada, yada. And then one day, a train crossing a bridge on this river, one of the wheels of the train going on the train track through a spark. The spark drifted down onto the river surface, onto a slick of oil and so on, and the river caught on fire. This was the 13th time the river caught on fire. The 12th time was during World War II, so the nation was distracted. This time, a top 40 hit song, Burn On, Big River, Burn On, was written about it. It made the cover of Time magazine. It was joked about on the Tonight Show. I almost said the Daily Show, but of course it's a different era. Today it would be the Daily Show. That was 69. But by 73, we had created the EPA and passed the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, all under Richard Nixon, actually. Change happened because you can ignore a lot of things, but when a river catches on fire in your country, you wake up and you say, we got to do something about that. And this particular form of externality or market failure was dealt with, and things have changed in that respect. Almost every environmental problem, not quite, but almost every environmental problem in the world is a case of a market failure. The forests that are chopped down are mostly public lands where A, no one owns them, and B, the government that exists there doesn't protect them. The lakes that are drained and aquifers that are drained, same way. The fish that are overfished are almost always in international waters where no one protects them. The air pollution, the air gets polluted because no one owns it, and climate change is the same way. All of those are commons. Market failure is usually another way of saying tragedy of the commons. Right? The damage that you're doing is also talked about as an externality. It's an external damage, external to you, the company, you, the person doing the pollution. But of course, it's internal to all of us in some way. And that's a very different view than the limits to growth, which just says, hey, if you get richer, you're going to cause damage. Because Cleveland is richer. It's twice as rich as it was in '69. But here's the Cuyahoga now. Of the 27 species that went extinct, I think about 23 of those are back now. You can drink out of the Cuyahoga. The place is great, and it didn't take ending economic growth to fix the problem. It just took putting the right rules in place. We decoupled growth from pollution. We can keep getting richer as a society. We can end poverty and make ourselves better off if we put the right rules in place to say, here's how you do it in a way that doesn't trash the planet. Right? Here's another example, the ozone layer. Who remembers the ozone hole? We woke up in the 1960s, scientists started warning us that we were thinning out the ozone layer. We did nothing about it, nothing about it, nothing about it. Certainty built and built and built. Then in the 1980s, we signed something called the Montreal Protocol. And now, NASA is telling us that it looks like the ozone layer hit bottom and is on path to recovery. It will take decades, these things, it takes a while for it to fix itself, but it looks like it's recovering a few years earlier than expected, and it looks like it's on path to making a full recovery. And it's doing so because we took these things called CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, that destroy ozone, and this thing called the Montreal Protocol that all the big nations signed phased them out in 10 years, basically just phased them out. Right? That took an international agreement. This was about 100 times easier than climate change as far as the amount of money it took to solve this. But even so, this is something that a lot of people did not want to do. Industry said at this time, I'll pull up scare quotes for you if you want, but the statements made by industry were, refrigeration will fail. People will die because medicines will go bad in hospitals. This is the last time you use an air conditioner in a car. Just forget about it. That was the quotes that were made. But of course, once you sign something that says CFCs will be phased out, then the economic pressure, the incentive to create a new invention that can cool vehicles and refrigerators and hospital coolers without destroying ozone is huge. And people will race to do that because there's billions of dollars they can make and they'll find a way. Or acid rain. Remembers that one? Acid rain is caused by sulfur dioxide, which comes from coal plants. To deal with acid rain, we invented a new thing called cap and trade, which everyone hated. Cap and trade said, we're going to create licenses to emit sulfur dioxide, and we're going to clamp down. The emission permits will go down in number every year, in the total volume of sulfur dioxide you can put out. But you guys who get them, you can trade them, buy them, sell them, do whatever you want. The people on the right hated it because you're going to make people do less. And a lot of people on the left hated it because they said it's a license to kill, it's a license to pollute. Terrible. Everyone said it wouldn't work. It's worked. The total emissions of sulfur dioxide have plunged by about a factor of 4, and it happened at about a quarter of the price that everybody thought that it would work. And all of this has been just a huge virtuous cycle. All of these things are just, I won't even get into this, but it's just been really, really good. The problem we have to deal with now, more than anything else, but it's really, this applies to all of the problems I've talked about. Freshwater, fish in the ocean, forests, but really I'll just use CO2 as a template, is we've got to find some way to provide an incentive to not pump carbon into the atmosphere. So my personal favorite is this one. You put a price on carbon, and you can do it in a way that doesn't hit people. You put the price on carbon, and at the same time, you reduce prices, you reduce taxes from the bottom. You start with a payroll tax, make it not regressive. So the total tax base, the total amount people are taking out of their pockets is the same, but when you go to shop for energy or some product, you're better off, it looks cheaper to buy the one that has less carbon. But ultimately, we're going to do it. There's momentum building to phase out or limit emissions of all sorts of fossil fuels, in this order, coal, oil, and natural gas, because that's the order in which they emit carbon emissions per unit of energy. And let me just give you examples of that, because I don't think people know how much is actually happening, and maybe it's not as much as we would like, but there's more happening than I think people know. We are done building coal plants in America. There's actually only one coal plant under construction in the United States today, and that is a demonstration plant for carbon capture technology, which may or may not work. I don't know. I'd like it to work. But either way, we're done. That's one pillar in the things that President Obama announced in his executive action plan. Okay? So that's one thing. But two, a lot of people have said for a long time, the US shouldn't act unless China acts. But China now has a very large problem that the Chinese are seeing massive protests, actually, inside of China, mostly over smog, actually, but coal is a big part of that, too. And so China has been shutting coal plants anywhere near their largest cities. China has opened carbon trading markets in 7 areas. They're just pilot plants, but those pilot trading programs are almost as big as the EU's fully operational program. And on day 1, the price of carbon permits was higher here than it was in the EU, meaning it was more painful to emit there. More interesting to me is what's happening in the private sector. A group with $4 trillion in assets a few months ago wrote a letter to all the largest fossil fuel companies and said, what's your plan? Said, look, we know that climate change is real, you do too. We know that the world's going to limit emissions on carbon, and you've got this stock price that assumes you're going to burn all of yours. Well, that's not going to happen, so give us your justification for your stock price so we don't sell. Which I thought was very interesting. And then this is my favorite. This happened in December. An amazing reporter at the New York Times got into a large number of companies and asked them about how they viewed the social cost of carbon, meaning what they thought of, should there be a carbon price, did they think there would be one? And a number of large companies answered her and gave her numbers. And these numbers, I will translate them at the end back to English. I trust that you're not all geeks about carbon pricing. But first, let's look at the companies. Walmart, banks, airlines, Google, GE, and energy companies. And these companies said numbers that are actually pretty reasonable. $40 a ton is a reasonable number. BP, this actually was Shell, BP, ConocoPhillips, Exxon. These numbers translate to about 6 cents a kilowatt hour, which is about a 50% increase in the cost of electricity, if you fully phase that in, about 60 cents a gallon of gasoline. And those are actually plausible numbers as far as what the real cost of carbon is. So that amazed me, that large energy companies internally to themselves think of the cost of carbon in that way. So I see that as just an indicator that there's momentum building here, especially when you see the private sector seeing that something is happening there. So I'm just going to wrap it up here. The Chinese pictogram for crisis is the pictogram for danger, the pictogram for opportunity put together. This is an amazing time to be alive, but we do have some real danger. But we also have some real opportunity. And the opportunity is to reinvent some of how society works and reinvent what we hitch our wagon to. And we have a chance to re-hitch our wagon to different energy sources, and energy sources that are good for 5 billion years, that are dropping in price, that could in fact be way cheaper than our current energy source down the road, and incredibly abundant, and not held hostage by foreign powers. So what can all of us do? I want to talk about 4 things that every person in this room can do. 1, communicate. Belief in any of these things is a problem really spreads person to person. It almost never spreads from politicians down or experts down, really. Maybe if you come to a room like this, it might a little bit. It spreads family member to family member, friend to friend, colleague to colleague. That's really how it actually works. 2, participate, and by that I mean politically. A lot of the action today on climate change and so on is at the state level. That's really where we see renewable energy being pushed. It's where we see the most exciting stuff happening. And your state senators and state representatives get very few calls to their offices. And there's a lot that can happen, and Oregon is actually a leader in this area. So there's a chance there. 3, innovate. Rejiggering our energy plan for the planet is going to take a lot of work. And there's a chance here, if you're a young person in the audience, or if you're thinking about a career change, there's a chance at all levels to innovate. Some of the innovation is going to be in the science and engineering. A lot of it's going to be in the business. How do you finance this stuff? How do you sell this stuff? How do you market this stuff? And 4, keep hope. Because we have faced problems like this before with the ozone layer, acid rain, all sorts of problems. And every time we've gotten backed into a corner, we've addressed them, we've beaten them. Ultimately, ideas are our most important resource. So, thank you very much.